Hello and welcome to the first episode of the RJM Classic Motorcycles podcast. We are a father and son classic motorcycle restoration business established in 1989. If you haven't heard the introduction, do check that out, it will help explain what this is all about. But in short, the first episode will be me interviewing my father Ray about his background, and in the second episode we'll hear about how and why he started the business. Enjoy! I suppose I should really start off by asking, what was it that first planted the seed of an interest in motorcycling?
Well, interesting, and as I've often said, prior to about 15 years of age, I had no interest in motorcycles whatsoever. I was brought up in a family where the father was a motor mechanic and for a Ford dealer, and at that time I could have told you every external variation on every side valve Ford Anglia that there ever was, but in terms of motorcycles I couldn't have told you what the names were. There was a middle-aged couple that lived next door with their teenage son, who had, the old man had what I believe now to be a James. I couldn't have told you that at the time, and early on the son had a D1 Bantam in the usual mist green. The D1 Bantam was then upgraded to what I'm now guessing was a C15 SS 80 in a very fetching metallic blue. But other than the fact it got a BSA badge on the tank, I couldn't have told you what it was. And it was only many years later, when my sister started bringing home boyfriends who were of the motorcycling persuasion, that I suddenly got an interest in it. The lads my sister was bringing home were not, the most conventional and conventionally hygienic people on the planet. In fact, some of the Brookman's Park lads, looked like they would wring the head off a chicken and eat it raw. I really wasn't involved in any of that, but later got to realise that there was a certain amount of stigma attached to, and delightfully a sort of rebel esprit de corps that went with the gang. I mean, to the point where if you go back then, a lot of people as part of their motorcycling regalia were wearing ex-World War II Nazi emblems, which you wouldn't dream of doing now.
No, certainly not. And you think that would be more acceptable now, as the war is more of a dim, distant memory?
Well, exactly. I mean, literally, some people were wearing ex-stormtroopers' helmets as crash helmets, complete with all the SS emblems and what have you. In fact, there was, again, from either Barnet or Potter's Bar, there was a couple of lads that used to rattle around on what I now suspect was a late G12 Matchless, again with the identical stormtroopers helmets and all the Nazi regalia on the jackets, and that was no more offensive and no more stigmatised than being a biker anyway. So
I can't imagine they were all that crash worthy though.
Oh no.
So your first motorcycle was an aerial arrow?
Well, actually an aerial leader, or bits of an aerial leader. One of the guys in the group, who was a little older than me but a little younger than the rest of the group, that I got to know and to ride with, had this rather decrepit looking, actually it had started off life as an aerial leader, that had just had all the major tinware ripped off it, and a nice sort of homemade aluminium lid to the now heavily modified dummy tank. And it was an aerial leader which had been formerly the property of Kent County Constabulary. So arguably I even started on a police bike, but when I bought it off him when he moved on to a 3TA, which again by this time had been stripped of all its bathtubs and tinware, it was in a pretty sad state and knew that it had to have a frame change, which is why I got it for the price I got it for at the time. And also somebody else in the group that I knew had been preparing a set of tinware for an aerial arrow that then became an abandoned project for one reason or another. So I bought the aerial leader plus a separate purchase of the arrow tinware, and promptly spent the next 6 months actually turning a serviceable into a serviceable bike. The main problem with the leader frame was it was split at the front, so that there was nothing firmly holding the headstock and head bearings. So, like when you've got normal worn-out head bearings, you can pull the fork backwards and forwards by an inch, half an inch, or whatever. This was more like 4 or 5 inches, so it was had it.
So I think I'm right in thinking that when you were building your Arrow, you had a bit of an infrastructure around you, because there would have been people round the garages all the time working on projects of their own as well.
Well, there was. I mean, like most council estates, you've got garage blocks, and in those garage blocks there were people spannering professionally part-time, people wrenching on their own projects. There was a lad and his father in the garage next to me who were restoring a mini-based Riley Elf, which was more than a little rusty. And somebody who, when we first moved next door to him, absolutely hated me, and was the bane of my life, who later turned out to be a very good friend and a great help to me in a lot of ways, was my Irish neighbour Dave, who was the main hobby wrencher round in the garage, although actually he wasn't, for the most part, building cars or repairing cars for himself, as to half the neighbourhood. Famously, there was another Irish lady up the road that he frequently used to work on her Renault.
Mrs. Maguire.
Mrs. Maguire.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've certainly grown up hearing tales of Dave. He had a few affectations, didn't he?
Oh yeah, I mean, as I say, when I finally got to know him, and we went from being sworn enemies to the best of chums. Some of the funny things he would say, we'd be looking, for example, at some old car that had got a very tired engine, and I would say, Dave, that engine's knackered, and straight back at you he would say, as if he was telling you something you didn't know, do you know what, Raymond, the motor's actually fogged. That wasn't all of it though. One of his famous little sayings that he regularly used to come out with, when there were apparently some design issues with what it was we were trying to work with, and he said, Jesus, Raymond, that's only a very fucking middling idea. And you knew exactly what he meant.
I mean, I'm sure he made up that word. I mean, along with fonent that, as I remember.
Oh yeah, that was again. It may have been some sort of local dialect from wherever in Ireland he came from, but that seemed to be a substitute word for all sorts of things. Sure, fonent that. Because of that, instead of that, it all seemed to be interchangeable. But he was a good laugh, and actually taught me quite a bit. I mean, I can remember, for example, on one occasion when I was desperately trying to get the nut off the end of the crankshaft on the aerial Arrow to replace an alternator rotor, and of course, without the head and barrel off, you've got no way of locking the rods to lock the crank to, be able to, and obviously no windy gun to be able to whiz the nut off the end of the crank. And I was getting very animated about it, and he saw this and just went wandering round the garage with a pair of pliers, and wandered back round 5 minutes later and said, "There, it's off."
I mean, it's like old age and treachery trumping youth and enthusiasm again, isn't it? I mean, obviously we've had that situation many times where I'm struggling with something and you come along and deal with it, and it's great. My reaction is you're at the same time incredibly relieved but very cross at the person because they've done something that you weren't able to.
Absolutely, and that is as nuanced as what we do is, because just the. I mean, it's like that locking ring this morning on that 3TA hub. I mean, that wasn't showing any signs of moving by conventional means.
No.
And all I did was got a slightly bigger hammer and a slightly more sturdy punch. And within 30 seconds or so, we were up and running again. But prior to that, it showed no interest in moving whatsoever. That's as nuanced as it is, and you can succeed or fail. On the minutest of detail.
Yeah, and I think another example of old age and treachery was always my woodwork teacher at school, who would demonstrate what he wanted you to do, and he'd saw through a block of wood in about 3 slices, and then you were there for 40 minutes trying to do it. It's impressive. So what happened after you got rid of the Arrow?
Well, actually, the Arrow, because I had that on the road for about 3 years, and got me to work and back. There's obviously a lot of backstory with that that we'll perhaps deal with another time. But then I acquired, because I was travelling a fair distance to work, a new bike, albeit on hire purchase, as you did back in the day, which was the little YCS 5E Yamaha, which was the predecessor to the RD200. Looked very similar, but was normally carbureted, didn't have the torque induction that the RD had, and was finished in a very fetching candy purple and white, whereas the RDs were always in some form of metal flake gold, which I had in one form or another for about six years, something like that. And once I'd finished using it for work, and once I'd passed my car test and started doing regular commuting on four wheels, of course it then became a leisure vehicle, and I remodeled and restored it, really because I had kind of a guilty conscience, because whilst I was using it as daily transport, of course, and particularly in the winter, you've just ridden 20 miles in the snow and you're freezing cold. On occasions my gauntlets were literally frozen to handlebars. And literally had to ride up the front path and bang the front wheel against the front door for somebody to come and pour warm water over my gloves.
Oh my gosh.
It was that kind of thing. So as a consequence, you didn't feel much like pushing the bike round the garage and tucking it up at night. So invariably through most winters it just sat there on the front path, and frequently in the morning you'd come out and it had fallen over into the flower bed.
Oh, no.
And you'd sort of brush the snow off it, pull it upright, and lazy little tyke that I was, just keep hitting the starter button, because of course it was a electric start, until the thing fired, and then you were off. So when I finished using it as regular transport, I kind of got a guilty conscience. I thought I need now to be being nice to this and kind to it. So I spent quite a bit of money, quite a bit of time restoring it.
Yeah, I remember, regarding snow, riding my little 50 down when I had it at the time, riding it down into the garages once, and the roads were clear, but there was still snow about going down into the garages. And as you know, I sort of put my feet down for stability, or that was the idea, and the front wheel just got caught in a patch of snow or ice or whatever and went down. Luckily it wasn't damaged, it was cushioned nicely by the snow, but I was left stood in midair thinking, oh dear, that was a shame.
I remember once pulling away from the lights just on the main road out of Marshallswick, where I used to live, on the 200, and it was quite a light bike and quite brisk on acceleration, and under acceleration hitting a patch of black ice with the rear wheel. Fortunately I managed to stay upright, but it certainly concentrated the mind.
So was it when you had your YCS 5E that you ended up acquiring an A65 for the first time?
Just trying to think of the chronology of this. Yes, it would have been. By this time, I was actually on the road as a sales rep for a then well-known Chrysler dealer in Hatfield, who also were parts wholesalers. So I went. It was my job to go around and visit all these little independent garages and try and sell them stuff, which I managed to do with a moderate degree of success. But one of the calls I used to regularly visit was a little independent repairer in Potter's Bar, wherein one of their their apprentice, who I had formerly known as part of the Hatfield mob, in terms of motorcycle groups. They were, sort of one of the next groups along from us geographically. So I'd known him from then, and he got this A65 cafe racer of sorts that he wanted to sell. It was, non-runner and in need of restoration, yada yada yada. And he kept on about it. And every time I went round there, the price got cheaper. And I think we got down to about 150 quid, which sounds ludicrous by today's standards.
Sure.
And I finally weakened and bought it off him. And for a long time wished I hadn't, because I should have known better. One of the characteristics of the Hatfield group was they rode around some of the most appalling bikes you've ever seen. One of them had an old twin port Panther outfit. Most of them had outfits because nobody in Hatfield had passed their test at that time.
Yeah.
And that was the dodge round it. If you got your third wheel, not only could you ride unlimited capacity on a provisional licence, but of course you could carry all your mates around as well, which you weren't able to do on a provisional on a solo of any capacity. But say that this guy had a Panther outfit, and I think it was just a wooden box on the chassis. But one of the exhaust systems had rusted and fallen off. So instead of repairing it or making making it good somehow, it just plugged the end up with a piece of round steel and just bound the sump up with some asbestos bandage.
Wow.
And on a dark night it would sit there glowing cherry red all the time, because of course the gas is trying to escape from both ports. It goes out one side and finds it can't get there, and so obviously I should have known better, because clearly habits hadn't changed. And of course this A65 Cafe Racer, being an ex-Hatfield mob bike, it was everything you'd have negatively expected.
They were just the sort of things people did to motorcycles then to keep them running. I mean, because they went through that period of people using them to go to work on and what.
No, that's right. I mean, I often say that some of the past repairs we see on some of the machines we get to work on are pretty appalling. And if it's a machine that hasn't been in service for a long time, it's to some extent forgivable, because back then if you broke it on Saturday, you got Sunday to fix it to go to work on Monday. No ifs, ands or buts. And some of those repairs weren't very pretty. And remembering also that the British motorcycle industry to a greater or lesser extent was at an end. All of the dealers that had been BSA, Triumph or whatever had now seen the Japanese product and realised you could do a pre-delivery inspection with a damp rag rather than actually have to start putting things right, and couldn't drop the British franchise fast enough in favour of these Jap machines. And of course, being pathologically mean, they didn't throw the old BSA or Triumph spares away. They tucked them down in the basement. But of course, the bottom line is they weren't accessible to us. Nobody knew where the stuff was, so you got way better parts availability by a quantum factor these days than we had back then. So you had to make repairs with second-hand stuff, with basically anything that came to hand. To say some of it wasn't very pretty.
Although new old stock stuff still turns up, maybe as a result of that.
Well, it does, and a classic example of that, of course, is that brand new Lightning head that had been kicking around quietly somewhere in Minnesota for about 30 or 40 years, that I acquired several months ago for a project that we're working on.
Yeah, and there does seem to be more stuff available in the States. Do we think that's mainly because they were always toys to the Americans because the economy was stronger, or what?
One of the things you've got to realise is that for the most part, the British motorcycle that was later become the classic. I mean, when I first started, nobody even coined the phrase, and Classic Bike magazine didn't exist.
Yeah. No, as I say, you've been working on these when they were just called motorcycles.
Indeed so. And I can remember almost within a sort of 3 or 6 month window, sometime in 1973 or 4, where actually the damn thing started appreciating in value rather than continuing to depreciate, and very shortly thereafter they became called classics. Some of the repairs weren't very pretty, but with regards to the States, they had bikes as toys or leisure vehicles. I mean, for us it was a cheaper alternative to a car, working man's transport, etc., etc. Over there, they were largely leisure vehicles, as is borne witness to by the fact that most of them had small American style fuel tanks, which wouldn't have got you very far.
No.
Not on historic Route 66, because some of the fuel consumption, some of the small capacities of the tanks, so they were toys. As a consequence, certainly the bikes, and there were an awful lot re-imported back into the UK, still are to a great extent, but of course the equation doesn't quite work out now, because whilst you look at a machine that's available, say on eBay in the US, and do the conversion from dollars to pounds, and think, well, actually, do you know what, that really is quite good value. By the time you've had it shipped, and particularly by the time HM Customs and Excise have got their grubby little paws on the paperwork and charged you importation duty and VAT, of course it doesn't make any sense at that point. So there's less of it happens now. But of course a lot, when it was economically more viable to do so, more attractive to do so, a lot of stuff was shipped back, and it was all good stuff because it hadn't sat outside some dark satanic factory all day in the rain and the snow, having got liberally covered in rock salt on the way to work. I mean, any of my friends who ever bought a new bike, I mean, the first winter it used to kill them, because if they were using them as regular transport, by the time the winter was over, the rock salt had to go,
I'm sure.
The rain and what have you. So none of the American stuff, generally speaking, was ever subjected to that. So as a consequence, the re-imported stuff was a lot better quality, done a lot less mileage, had been a lot less mucked about with. But of course, as much of that sort of stuff that was exported to the US, and I mean, remembering after the war, in industry, the adage was, export or die, because nobody got any money over here to buy this sort of stuff, and there was a deliberate move by the government at the time to suppress any consumer demand by ridiculous levels of taxation on things to free all this stuff for export for US dollars, so we could pay the Americans back for the bullets and the tanks we rented off them or bought off them to fight the war to liberate continental Europe from its own stupidity.
Yeah, it sounded like there was a lot of difficulties in trade with the States then. I remember a story about George Harrison acquiring a Fender Stratocaster, and there was real troubles involved in getting that, and you just can't imagine it now.
Yeah, no, I mean, there were all sorts of legislated limits, because I mean, if there had suddenly been some consumer demand for imported goods in the UK immediately post-war and into the 50s, the state of our economy was such that it couldn't have been sustained. So there were all sorts of legislative blocks put on the importation of foreign goods in all sorts of ways, which nobody would know now, nobody would realise.
No. So I think I'm right in saying that between you acquiring your first A65 and making it roadworthy, you had a couple of machines in the meantime.
Well, I did. One of the people I used to call on as this auto part sales representative that I was at this time was famously a motorcycle dealer in Welwyn Garden City called Ken Green. And I used to sell him NGK spark plugs, amongst other things. And he got this tired but quite reasonable SR500, which I fancied. I mean, obviously, the A65 was turning out to be a longer and more expensive project than I'd had anticipated. As we now know, all restoration projects end up that way.
Sure.
And I'd sort of put a financial limit on it, as people try to do. And as we got closer and closer to the limit and further away from actually finishing it, so the project slowed up. And in fact, I found in the end that the best way to revitalise the project was to throw all the old invoices away, and forget about the budget.
Yeah.
I either wanted to do it or not. But in the meantime, because by now I'd passed my bike test and I was keen to get something, more like full size, say first thing I clapped eyes on was this SR500 Yamaha, and because of course it was an honorary classic, being an air-cooled 500 single, with some, sort of nodding acknowledgement to old Brit stuff. I thought this was, a good move to tide me over until I could get this damned A65 on the road. But they talk about British singles being difficult to start, and actually, with the possible exception of Velocets, they're not. If you know what to do and have got the right technique, then it's all relatively straightforward. But the SR500 was a swine amongst swines. I was limited. For the first 3 months I owned that bike, I was limited as to the friends I could go and visit. It was only a leisure bike. On the basis that those would be people who might be able to start it so I could go home if I really couldn't. It never came to that, but it runs through your mind.
I think regarding starting, especially with British motorcycles, it's a bit like brakes in the sense it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that people think, oh, well, they're difficult to start, so they don't put any work into making them easier to start. Same with brakes. They think, well, British bikes have rubbish brakes, so they don't do anything to make them work.
And as we both know, they can be improved enormously, and as you say, there's nothing worse than a self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, a perfect example of that, and we'll go into this particular model in a lot more detail later. But BSA Starfire.
Yeah.
Obviously I've got a bit of a background with those, good and bad, which we'll go into later. But fundamentally the point is that these things had a reputation for being difficult to start and being mechanically noisy. Now, what I've discovered fairly early on with rebuilding the first one I ever did for production racing was that from a certain build period onwards, they had a cam wheel with 2 timing marks on. And, if you read the workshop manuals from memory, it says something along the lines of up to a certain engine number, use the dash, and from a certain engine number, use the V. Well, that is all completely bogus.
As we know.
Because actually, when you compare a dual-stamped cam wheel with one that's only got the dash on it, you'd expect the 2 dashes to be in the same place, but they're not.
Of course.
The V on the later one is where the dash is on the early one. Now, the upshot of this is that an awful lot of Starfires and TR25W trophies have been running around for most of their lives with the valve timing 3 teeth out. And you think, well, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because they will run quite happily like that. They're difficult to start against a background of it having a reputation for being difficult to start, and they're mechanically noisy against them having a reputation for being mechanically noisy. So how many of these bikes never, for the bulk of their life, gave fully of themselves because they'd been wounded from the get-go? And the only literally clue that you can find that they've been mistimed in this way is that as you dismantle the engine, you'll find the inlet valve has been gently grazing the cutaway on the piston.
Yeah. And
then it's been handicapped for a long time.
That is a great piece of knowledge to have. Anybody with a B25, that story gets wheeled out.
Well, and when people phone or email to talk about B25, and I bring this subject up, particularly if it's somebody who's having difficulty with a rebuild or a restoration, I'm fairly quick to highlight, this is one of the nuances that you need to be aware of with this particular model. By no means the only ones. And the feeling I get fed back to me is one of distinct scepticism. They don't believe it.
Yeah. So we can talk more about B25s in a bit, but you say about that SR500, you were a bit shy about going places in terms of difficulty to start it, but you took it to the Isle of Man many times.
Oh no, absolutely right. And really, we tortured that poor old bike. I've got the biggest pair of throw-over panniers you've ever seen in your life. In the finisher, a refurbished Craven top box on the rack with a big stuffer roll on top of that. And a tank bag I could barely see over the top of, with the girlfriend as she was in the beginning on the back, and that did.
Don't talk about my mother like that.
that rattled us quite happily. The 200 and some odd miles up to Liverpool to get the ferry. Rattled us round on the island and brought us back on several occasions. But it was a lot of work for that bike to do.
And you marshalled at the Isle of Man for some years, didn't you?
Did marshalled for the Manx Grand Prix races for I think 9 years running throughout the 1980s, and actually stayed at Sarah's cottage on the island and marshalled from there as well. The beauty of that being, of course, that unlike everybody else who had to get up at the crack of Sparrow Fart and get to their marshalling points before the roads closed, we could saunter out of bed and have a leisurely breakfast after the roads had closed.
Yeah, that sounds like the way to do it.
Oh, yes.
So there was something after the SR 500, but before the A65 went back on the road, right?
Well, yeah. Obviously, as we were doing a fair bit of mileage, and as I said, it was a lot of hard work for the SR. I finally, after several months, got the knack of starting it, and as a consequence, that was almost a rite of passage, because I remember in the very early days of the business, somebody I remembered from back in the old days showed up at the shop with a matchless G80, the Les Harris version, which had a Rotax engine, was a single 500, no electric starter and a left-hand kickstart.
Wow.
And challenged me to be able to start it, and I did so, I think, second kick. And he said, "How the hell did you do that?" And I said, "Former SR 500 owner. Seemingly you need have given no further explanation. As in, if he'd have known that, he wouldn't have challenged me in the first place."
Yeah, and we still get customers to this day having trouble to start their bikes, and a lot of it just comes down to technique, doesn't it? And what you're used to.
It is entirely down to it's down to setup and technique. What you have to remember is if your bike is not able to idle easily, which translates to and at a sensibly low speed, which translates to kick-starting speed, you'd probably start it, but you'd have to be starting it or swinging on the Kickstarter so fast you'd be doing 30 mile an hour on the road, and that's never going to happen. I mean, we know, because we've played a little bit with starting rollers, and we know that just about anything, if you can get it rotating fast enough, eventually it will start. But, not at foot cranking speeds. So it's set up and it's technique, and most things, as I say, with the notable exception of Velocets, which I've never worked on, never had a desire to work on, and even now people who are dyed-in-the-wool Velocet people turn up at events and they can't start the damn things either. So with the possible exception of Velocet, most things can be made to start relatively straightforwardly and relatively easily, once you've got the setup, once you've got the technique.
After the SR500, I know exactly what this is because you still complain about it to this day. It was your Harris Bonnie. Well,
it was, as I say, because the SR500 was struggling a bit with two grown-ups and all their luggage on it. I was looking for something a bit bigger and a bit more capable. In fact, one of the things I'd looked at the time, and most people don't remember them now, is a Yamaha TR1, which was a V-twin. But when I saw that Les Harris was starting to build the T140 down in Devon, down in Newton Abbot, under licence as a sort of interim while John Bloor got the Hinckley factory built, I thought, now here's an opportunity.
Yeah.
I want a bigger bike. I can afford a bigger bike. I've got the last opportunity. I'll probably get to buy a brand new Triumph Bonneville and keep it forever and love it forever, and so on. What I didn't realise, of course, at the time is that whereas I'd read all the literature that said these are smoother, faster, better built, better braked, etc., etc., what it amounted to was residual parts from Meriden, cobbled together with a collection of Les Harris's pattern parts, which, the fact that he later got the licence to call his parts original equipment in perpetuity is analogous to the lunatics taking over the asylum, because certainly then, Les Harris's parts had a reputation for being, some of the worst copy parts you were ever likely to find. I would be the first to acknowledge that has probably changed an awful lot. I mean, because we use some Les Harris stuff in the course of repairs, but
Yeah, absolutely.
the other thing was, of course, there was a lot of bought-in stuff. So you got Paoli forks, Brembo brakes. It had a twin disc front end which had never been properly sorted, because you've got this dirty great lump of 2 lumps of cast iron on the front end as unsprung weight, with some really impressive stopping power. I mean, make no mistake about that. But of course, they hadn't really thought about the springing. In the finish, I had to get the supplying dealer to contact Les Harris, to contact the Italian fork suppliers to get some sidecar duty forks to make the bike rideable at all.
Wow.
And it was. But and you'd also got the silencers that he used were something called LaFranconis, which looked a bit like the earlier sort of cigar-shaped reverse cones that were used on the later Meriden-built T140s. But I mean, A, being Italian, the chrome was paper thin, and 2, they weighed an absolute ton. So we got rid of those fairly quickly. But that was, I mean, the bike was a disaster. We managed to get extended warranty. I mean, for example, whilst I was doing the initial running in period before the first service, it was pinking and detonating all over the place. I mean, you had to ride round this all the time, because actually, if you get any pinking while you're riding a Triumph, you need to think about getting it sorted, because you'll have the top off a piston as quick as ninepence. And when I returned it back to Roebuck, who were the supplying dealer, I said, look, for the 500 mile service, I said, look, if you do nothing else, get rid of that pinking. Get those carburetors, get that timing dialed in so it's not doing that, because I've got no performance I can use. So he said, yeah, sure enough, fine. So I pick it up, and on the way home it's still pinking and detonating. And as it just so happened, on the following day, which was a Sunday, me and her indoors had to be somewhere on it, by a certain time. So we're heading south on the A1M, and we're climbing some of those hills between here and Welwyn Garden City and Hatfield.
Yeah.
And it pink, and I just got so annoyed that I pulled in the clutch, dropped it down a couple of gears and wound it open. I'm thinking, never mind ride round it, I'll try and ride through it, because it was getting desperate. You're on a brand new 750 motorcycle and you're crawling up hills at 30 miles an hour on the motorway.
Yeah, I think at that stage you have to.
Well, needless to say, didn't take long, and it was bang, bang, misfire, thud, thud, lots of smoke, pull on the hard shoulder, and we'd taken the top off a piston.
Wow.
So, I mean, that was just the start of it. This is a brand new motorcycle under warranty, that's supposed to be smoother, faster, better built, etc., etc. I don't think so. And that was only the beginning.
I'd love to have seen what that looked like inside.
Well, actually, because it's quite common on Triumph, well, it used to be at one time, obviously, these days, with the benefit of electronic ignition, even being hampered by what passes for modern road fuel, you don't see it very often. But it's actually just quite a small hole, just bored through the side of the crown of the piston, just adjacent to the spark plug. And, I had friends back in the day who got collections of these on their shelf in the shed as souvenirs.
So, with your time through owning these two bikes, you had this A65 the whole time. You've been working away at it, and the day finally comes that it's back on the road.
Well, actually, it was more as a result of the trials and tribulations of the T140 that actually had two results. One, although the A65 project had been dormant for some time, I managed to convince myself that if I couldn't build a better bike than the one I was currently trying to ride, then I needed my bum kicking. And two, that actually, there needed to be somebody in this industry who knew how to get these things right. So it set an extra little germ in my mind in terms of going into this as a business eventually. And what I'm saying is, without that Bonnie, I would probably never have done it. And also made me finally have the get up and go to get the A65 finished.
So it was worth it in the end.
No, I mean, in more, it's an ill wind that blows no bug for some good. And yeah, as troublesome and as adverse as the set of circumstances seemed at the time, what they led to was ultimately very beneficial, needless to say.
So what happened after the A65 had been back on the road for a bit?
Well, I was actually, because I'd still, as time went on, as I got more and more work done under warranty, we were slowly getting the Bonnie sorted. One of the drawbacks that we struggled with for ages on it was the fact that, the manufacturer, I suspect out of pathological meanness, decided that it was not going to have the Mark II concentrics that the Meriden ones had. It would have Mark 1.5s. Now, if you've never come across it, it's a very strange device. It's a stub-mounted carburettor, obviously like a Mark II, but for all other intents and purposes, it looks like a Mark I concentric, except it's got no tickler button. And actually, when you interrogate it, a lot of the internals are Mark II, not Mark I. But of course, it was made in Spain and it was cheap.
I've never seen a Mark 1.5.
We've got one on the shelf. I'll show you.
Oh, really? Well, I've done side floats, monoblocks, concentrics, Mark II concentrics, Mikunis, SUs, but never a Mark 1.5.
Yeah. So we were getting sorted with it slowly, but obviously then I've got the A65 finished and I'm starting to get some mileage on that now. Obviously, I bought it as a calf racer with the deliberate intention to rebuild it as a calf racer, albeit way prettier than it had been before. I mean, certain of the things that I originally bought, when I originally bought that H65, that it had fitted to it, I threw away straight away. Notably, this plug ugly looking fiberglass petrol tank that I was never going to ride a bike with a tank that ugly. So, if it never went back on the road because I couldn't find another tank, sod it, so be it.
Yeah. I think it's worth pointing out that you can actually have a look at these bikes on our website, can't you? RJMclassic.com.
Yeah, on the homepage there's some before and afters, and the before and after of that very first A65 is there down towards the bottom of the list. So you can see it for yourself. But what I did discover, no surprise, is that as in calf racer configuration, it was very uncomfortable to ride any distance, and you certainly wouldn't want to do so with a pillion rider, which as connections sometimes go, one thing leads to another, and I thought, well, yeah, it's not an ideal road bike. Let's go racing, which is where another chapter was opened. I looked around for the right home, for the bike as a race bike, and it turned out to be the Classic Racing Motorcycle Club. I went along to joined and went along to a meeting at a pub on the A1, and that was where I met who later turned out to be my racing teammate and subsequently my original business partner with RJM Classic Motorcycles.
Yeah.
That's all for this week. You've been listening to me, Rowan, and my father, Ray. If you enjoyed this show, please subscribe and give us a review on iTunes. Just a reminder, our website is rjmclassic.com, and you can contact me directly about the podcast at rjmpodcast@gmail.com. See you next week.